That quiet October night was shattered by the desperate cries of a mother. In the peaceful town of Union, South Carolina, Susan Smith went on national television claiming her children had been kidnapped. She described the abductor as a black man with a gun who had driven away with her car and her 2 sons, while she stood by helplessly. It was the beginning of one of the most cold-blooded and calculated hoaxes in American criminal history. But something felt off. Susan's eyes were too cold. Her tears seemed perfectly rehearsed, and her words, though dramatic, echoed with the emptiness of someone hiding a dark abyss inside. The entire country was shaken. People prayed. They searched. They cried alongside her. Meanwhile, the bodies of Michael and Alexander were slowly sinking into the dark waters of John D. Long Lake. What could drive a mother to commit such an unspeakable act? What kind of despair leads someone to extinguish the lives of her own children and then turn grief into performance? The Susan Smith case is more than just a crime. It's an open wound in America's collective soul, a twisted story of loneliness, manipulation, rejection, and a chilling emotional void that still haunts anyone who remembers those days. Get ready to dive into the dark heart of this brutal case. A story that challenged the FBI, stunned psychologists, exposed structural racism, and laid bare the fragile limits of the human condition. Welcome to Urban Hauntings. Here we explore mysteries, paranormal stories, and real-life crimes, always with depth, empathy, and a sense of the unseen. If this kind of content speaks to you, help us grow. Hit like, leave your theories in the comments, share with others who love the eerie and the unknown, and subscribe with notifications turned on. Your support makes all the difference. Now, let's get into today's case. On the night of October 25, 1994, the town of Union, South Carolina was thrown into panic. Susan Smith appeared on camera sobbing, claiming to be the victim of a carjacking. According to her, a black man with a gun had forced her out of her vehicle and driven off, with her 2 young sons still strapped in the back seat. The story hit national news within hours. Flyers were printed, news segments exploded, helicopters flew overhead. Authorities brought in the FBI to assist with the case. For 9 days, Susan stood in front of the cameras with tear-filled eyes and a trembling voice. She begged for the safe return of Michael Daniel, age 3, and Alexander Tyler, just 14 months old. Her image, the heartbroken mother, moved not only South Carolina, but the entire country. Search efforts intensified, supported by local volunteers, media coverage, and law enforcement. Even Buffalo Baptist Church held prayer vigils. For a moment, the entire nation clung to the hope of a miracle. But behind the scenes, investigators started to raise their eyebrows. Susan's story had holes. Her behavior shifted between despair and something eerily cold. Sheriff Howard Wells picked up on inconsistencies. The timeline didn't quite add up, and the supposed intersection where the carjacking occurred had a traffic light that only turned red when another car was present, a detail that clashed with her account. That alone set off alarm bells. Then there was her description of the alleged abductor. Vague, generic, like something pulled from a stereotype. FBI agent David Caldwell noted the lack of hard evidence. No witnesses, no surveillance footage, no tire marks or signs of struggle. Even so, forensic sketch artist Roy Pascal drew up a composite based on Susan's description, a sketch that made the front pages, driving a manhunt for a suspect that never existed. The pressure mounted, and so did the unanswered questions. Susan kept up the lie for nearly a full week, manipulating public opinion and even seasoned law enforcement. But while she cried on TV, her children were already dead. Their lifeless bodies sat submerged at the bottom of John D. Long Lake, still strapped into their car seats in the back of a Mazda Protege. The truth would turn out to be even more horrifying than anyone could imagine. As the days dragged on, police expanded the search area and began diving deeper, beyond the 30-foot depth they'd initially explored. And all the while, Susan was beginning to unravel. Her mask of maternal agony started to crack. It would only take one misstep for her entire performance to collapse. But to the public, she was still the grieving mother, the woman destroyed by loss. Few could have guessed they were watching the mastermind of one of the most chilling and calculated crimes in modern American history. Long before the murders, Susan Smith's emotional instability was already evident. At 6 years old, She endured the devastating trauma of her father's suicide, a wound that scarred her adolescence. By 13, she had already attempted to take her own life. In high school, she carried a deep sadness that no one fully understood. Later, after graduating, she again attempted suicide after being rejected by a married man with whom she'd been involved. Her need for affection had become all-consuming and dangerous. Susan's relationship with her mother had long been complicated, but things became truly toxic after her mother married Beverly C. Russell Jr., a well-known figure in local politics and an influential member of Buffalo Baptist Church. What looked like a fresh start for the family quickly turned into a hidden nightmare. Behind closed doors, Russell sexually abused Susan during her teenage years, abuse she would later confirm herself. The most disturbing part, the inappropriate encounters continued until just 6 months before the crime. Susan grew up in an environment where trust was dangerous and love always came with pain. At 19, she married David Smith, a young factory worker from the region, hoping to reinvent herself as a wife and mother. But the marriage was unstable from the start, full of fights, mutual infidelities, and repeated separations. Still, they had 2 children together, Michael and Alexander. For Susan, the boys were both a lifeline and an emotional weight. She often felt alone, trapped, and unloved. When David filed for divorce, Susan sank even deeper into silent despair. Amid her emotional wreckage, she met Tom Findlay, wealthy, handsome, successful, and the son of Susan's boss. They had a brief affair, one that reignited her fantasy of escaping her chaotic life. But that dream came crashing down with a letter. In it, Tom clearly stated he didn't want children in his life. To Susan, it was more than a breakup. It was the death of hope, stability, and validation. That rejection became the final trigger in a downward spiral that was already out of control. With a broken heart and a fragile mind, Susan began thinking about ending her own life, and maybe her children's as well. Her emotional landscape was shaped by dependent personality disorder, a condition that made her believe life wasn't worth living without the affection of others. She felt cornered. No future, no escape, only pain, abandonment, and a deafening silence growing louder by the day. For her, loneliness was a death sentence. Susan had become an emotional time bomb, but no one saw it, or wanted to. On the outside, she looked like the hardworking mom, the polite neighbor, the dedicated employee. But inside, she carried a wounded child, a failed wife, a rejected lover. And in that place of deep vulnerability, she made one of the most cold-blooded and devastating decisions in American true crime history. From the very beginning, investigators sensed something was off. Susan Smith seemed shaken, but her emotions felt offbeat. Tears without crying, blank stares, lines that sounded rehearsed. Sheriff Howard Wells noticed the first cracks on the night of the alleged crime. Susan said the carjacking happened when she stopped at a red light. But that detail, that light, would become her fatal mistake. According to her story, she stopped at the intersection when the light turned red, and that's when the carjacker appeared out of nowhere. But when police inspected the scene, the Department of Transportation revealed a crucial technical detail. That traffic light only turned red if another car was approaching the intersection. Susan had said the road was empty. There was no way the light could have changed. It was a deadly contradiction, a flaw in her performance that shattered her credibility. The FBI, already involved in the case, stepped in under Agent David Caldwell. He scheduled a polygraph test just 2 days after the reported kidnapping. The result? Inconclusive, but with significant spikes in heart rate and perspiration when asked about the children's whereabouts. At this point, police optimism gave way to growing suspicion. Susan's behavior didn't help. During interviews, she seemed more concerned with her appearance than with the investigation, and she dodged direct questions. Field investigations revealed a disturbing emptiness. No witnesses saw the car get stolen. No neighbors heard screams. No security footage captured any suspicious activity. No fingerprints, other than Susan's, were found on the Mazda protege. It was as if the carjacker never existed, because he didn't. Police began searching nearby lakes and reservoirs. John D. Long Lake quickly drew their attention. Divers started combing its edges, but because they believed the car wouldn't be more than 30 feet from the shoreline, they didn't expand the search. That was a mistake. The car, with both children inside, was over 120 feet out, completely submerged. While this was happening, Susan continued her public performance. She prayed with the community, spoke at candlelight vigils, and stood in front of cameras portraying the image of a devastated mother. But it was all an act, one that couldn't last forever. The inconsistencies kept piling up. Susan forgot basic details. She couldn't remember where she'd parked. She kept changing her story about how the man got into the car. Her answers became more vague by the day. Federal and local agents decided it was time to turn up the heat. It became a race against time. Either she confessed, or something far worse would rise from the dark waters of that lake. The nation, once united in compassion, was now watching in disbelief, and the eyes of justice were wide open. On the morning of November 3rd, 1994, 9 days after her false report, Susan Smith finally broke. Brought in for another round of questioning, she could no longer hold herself together. Her answers faltered, her voice cracked, her eyes drifted, and then, almost in a whisper, she said the words no one wanted to hear, but many had already suspected. "I wasn't carjacked. My kids are in the lake." The room froze. Sheriff Howard Wells wrote down the confession with trembling hands. Susan calmly explained in chilling detail how she had buckled the boys into their car seats in the back, put the car in neutral, stepped out, and let the Mazda protege roll down into the lake. She said she just stood there watching. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She simply stared as the vehicle slipped beneath the surface. The children were still alive. Michael, her oldest, reportedly shouted, "Mommy, no!" Seconds later, and the water silenced everything. The confession hit the nation like a thunderclap. The woman who had tugged at America's heartstrings was now the face of betrayal. Divers quickly located the car, submerged 122 feet from the shore. Inside, the boys were still strapped in, the windows closed, the seatbelts intact. Michael's body was leaning forward, as if he had tried to escape. Alexander looked like he had been asleep. The pain was unbearable. It sliced through the country like a blade. The scene was described as devastating. Seasoned officers cried. Journalists broke down during live broadcasts. And the public, the same one that once prayed alongside Susan, now demanded justice. Prosecutor Tommy Pope took over the case and immediately announced she would be charged with 2 counts of aggravated murder. The official charges were filed the very same day of her confession. The atmosphere in Union shifted overnight. Blind faith was replaced by outrage, grief, and a collective sense of betrayal. But the motive behind the crime remained a point of tension. Susan claimed it wasn't premeditated, that she wasn't in her right mind, that she had been consumed by overwhelming despair. But then investigators found the letter from Tom Findlay. In it, he made it clear he didn't want children in his life. Susan, in her fractured state of mind, saw that as a deal-breaker. In her twisted logic, eliminating her children meant eliminating what kept her from being loved. That level of emotional detachment pushed the case from tragic to monstrous. Still, Susan tried to control the narrative. She claimed she had intended to die alongside her sons, but backed out at the last moment. She pleaded emotional breakdown, mental confusion, and instability. But her behavior over those 9 days of deception told another story. The nation, wounded and furious, demanded punishment. The image of that car being pulled from the lake, dripping silence, became one of the darkest symbols in American criminal history. National mourning had turned into public judgment. Susan Smith's trial began in July of 1995, under intense media scrutiny. The courtroom became a battleground, emotional, moral, and legal. Prosecutor Tommy Pope portrayed Susan as cold, calculating, and immoral, a monster who sacrificed her own children for a relationship. He pushed hard for the death penalty, stating that nothing could ever redeem what she had done. The public outrage was visible. People lined up outside the courthouse for a chance to witness justice unfold. The defense team, led by renowned attorneys David Bruck and Judy Clark, took a different path. In her opening remarks, Clark said, "This is not a case about evil. It's a case about despair." They brought in psychiatrist Dr. Seymour, who testified that Susan suffered from dependent personality disorder and severe depression. Her history of suicide attempts, sexual abuse by her stepfather Beverly Russell, and repeated emotional rejection were all cited as evidence of her crumbling mental state. The defense argued that Susan didn't act out of hatred, but out of collapse. They claimed she intended to take her own life alongside her children, but that her body, in a moment of unconscious impulse, walked away from the car. But that theory was met with deep skepticism. The way Susan calmly lied for 9 days, her composed interviews, her lack of any real suicide attempt, all undermined the argument. Still, the defense leaned heavily on medical reports and childhood trauma. Emotional testimonies poured in. David Smith, her ex-husband, wept as he described the agony of losing his children and the unbearable truth that their mother was the one responsible. Child behavior specialists testified that Michael likely felt fear and may have even understood what was happening. This wasn't just a legal trial, it was a human reckoning. The courtroom became a mirror, reflecting a society struggling to define guilt, trauma, and justice. After weeks of proceedings, the jury deliberated. It took just 2.5 hours to return a verdict. Guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Susan cried, but she didn't beg. During sentencing, the prosecution once again demanded the death penalty, describing in painful detail the boy's final moments. But the jury couldn't reach unanimous agreement on capital punishment. Instead, Susan was sentenced to 2 life terms, to be served concurrently, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The decision sparked divided reactions. For some, it was fair, a sliver of redemption. For others, it was far too lenient, a response that didn't match the brutality of the crime. The Susan Smith case became a subject of study in criminal psychology, a warning about the dangers of untreated trauma and emotional silence. And in that courtroom, amid medical records and photos of drowned children, the world saw something even more terrifying than evil, the abyss that opens when pain meets desperation. But there was another pain, another betrayal. When the truth surfaced, it wasn't just the death of 2 children that shocked the United States. It was the weight of exposed prejudice. Susan Smith had lied. She had falsely accused a black man of kidnapping her children. That lie reignited America's deepest fears. In a country with a long, painful history of racial injustice, during those 9 days of national panic, hundreds of black men were stopped, questioned, and viewed with suspicion. A racial panic had been triggered by a cruel invention. Civil rights organizations demanded public apologies. Sheriff Howard Wells, visibly shaken, issued a heartfelt apology to the black community. Even Susan's own family acknowledged the damage caused by her accusation. Her desperate attempt to deflect blame not only derailed the investigation, it also fed into long-standing racist stereotypes. It was another open wound in the already blood-stained history of discrimination in America. A brutal reminder that even skin color can be weaponized by those who lie. Culturally, the case became a symbol of emotional manipulation, coldness, and selfishness. Susan Smith was turned into a character, featured in documentaries, TV series, and even music. In 1995, the band Blind Melon released Car Seat, God's Presence, inspired by the tragedy. TV shows like Law and Order and even Arrested Development referenced the case. The image of a white woman crying in front of cameras became a disturbing symbol of the disconnect between appearance and truth. She wasn't a grieving mother, she was a murderer. On an institutional level, the case prompted significant changes in how missing child investigations are handled. The use of polygraph testing was re-evaluated, as was the response time for underwater searches. The initial failure to look beyond 30 feet in John D. Long Lake became a cautionary tale. The cost of trusting unreliable accounts, of losing precious time, was paid in lives. And those failures are now taught in law enforcement manuals and training courses across the country. Susan's time in prison also became the subject of controversy. In the year 2000, it was revealed that she had engaged in sexual relationships with prison guards at the Camille Griffin Graham Correctional Institution. The scandal triggered a public outcry and led to her transfer to the Leith Correctional Institution, where she remains to this day. In November 2024, Susan was denied parole. Following the decision, reports described a total emotional breakdown inside her cell, screaming, throwing objects, an explosion of rage and frustration. Decades have passed, but the name Susan Smith still sends chills down the spine. Not only because of the crime itself, but because of what it represents. The combination of untreated trauma, suffocating loneliness, and a society that too often ignores the signs of collapse. Michael Daniel and Alexander Tyler became eternal symbols of innocence stolen too soon. And Susan, even behind bars, remains alive, trapped in a past she drowned, along with her sons, in the dark waters of a lake the world will never forget. During the 9 days between the false report and her confession, law enforcement received over 1,000 phone calls with supposed tips, sightings, and leads. It became one of the largest mobilizations in South Carolina history. The emotion spread across the entire United States. Ordinary citizens volunteered in the searches, donated resources, and joined in prayer vigils. Susan exploited this wave of compassion, manipulating public opinion and delaying the only rescue that truly mattered, the rescue of the truth. For 6 long days, the country held on to false hope. At one point, a report nearly broke national headlines. A young child matching Michael's description was found alone at a gas station in another state. The news spread like wildfire, but minutes later, it was dismissed. Just another wound in the hearts of those who were still hoping for a miracle. Even with rising skepticism, investigators pressed forward, waiting for the confession to come from Susan's own lips. The car was eventually found 122 feet from the shore, a critical failure in the initial search operation, which had only explored up to 30 feet. That mistake became a lesson in rescue training, a reminder of how dangerous it is to rely too heavily on assumptions. The children's car seats were still tightly secured, their seatbelts still fastened. The Mazda sank slowly, with both boys still alive inside. Experts later calculated that the descent into the lake took approximately 6 minutes, an eternity of suffering. Susan was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. That made her eligible to request parole on November 20th, 2024. The request was submitted, reviewed, and, as many expected, denied. The parole board made their reasoning clear. Susan had shown no genuine signs of remorse and was still considered a threat to society. She'll be allowed to apply again in 2 years, but public sentiment remains strongly against her release. Over the years, Susan has accumulated numerous disciplinary infractions while incarcerated. The scandal involving her relations with prison staff in 2000 shook the institution and reinforced her reputation as a manipulator. It prompted a full review of the rules governing high-profile inmates. She was moved to Leith Correctional Institution, where she now lives in extended isolation, far from contact with other inmates. Over time, more than 20 books, TV series, and songs have referenced Susan Smith's crime. Pop culture absorbed and recycled the tragedy, often using it as a platform to explore deeper issues of racism, motherhood, mental illness, and justice. Susan's story is not just about a crime. It's a distorted mirror reflecting society itself, its prejudices, its rush to judge, its deep discomfort with confronting evil when it wears the face of a weeping mother. John D. Long Lake, once a peaceful retreat in Union County, now carries a shadow that will never lift. Its still waters conceal a tragedy too heavy for words. The image of the car being slowly pulled from the bottom of the lake, with the children's bodies still strapped into their seats, became a national symbol of horror. The surrounding landscape, once just part of the scenery, was transformed into a monument of mourning. Since then, the lake has ceased to be a place of leisure. It became a natural grave, a cursed place haunted by memory. Locals say that for months after the crime, the area around the lake felt colder. Families stopped visiting. Children avoided walking near it. The silence hovering over the water seemed to carry the weight of 2 innocent lives lost there. The trauma didn't belong only to the Smith family. It was shared by the entire town. Union, South Carolina, was etched into the national consciousness, forever marked as the place where a mother drowned her own children. Over time, the lake began drawing visitors, curious onlookers, journalists, even TV crews. But for the residents, every parked car near the water was a cruel reminder. On every anniversary of the tragedy, flowers were left on the shore, letters, drawings, stuffed animals. It was as if the lake had become an altar, for grief, for reflection, for repentance. Even the sound of the water hitting the rocks carried a sadness that didn't exist before. It was the sound of absence, echoing across time. The The lake itself became a silent character in this story, an unwilling accomplice, a keeper of the secret until the truth finally surfaced. Many of the divers who helped recover the vehicle never returned to active duty. They say the sight, the car seats, the lifeless bodies, the watery darkness, never left their minds. Water, for all its cleansing symbolism, did not wash away anything here. At John D. Long Lake, it merely concealed. And in that moment, the lake became the heart of a wound that never healed. In the years that followed, local authorities considered fencing off the perimeter of the lake to prevent future incidents. Rumors of suicide attempts in the same location began to circulate. The site, now soaked in symbolism, started to attract people searching for an end, or for answers. Some religious groups even held purification prayers along the shoreline, but nothing could erase what had happened there. The deep, dark waters seemed to hold the final cries of those boys. And maybe they still do. Even now, in the year 2025, the mere mention of John D. Long Lake sends shivers down the spine of anyone familiar with the case. It's not just a point on the map. It's a marker on the timeline of American pain. A place where the sound of a car engine became confused with the last sighs of goodbye, where a calm surface hid one of the most disturbing crimes in recent United States history. Among all the elements surrounding the Susan Smith case, few carry as much symbolic weight as the letter from Tom Findlay. Written just days before the crime, its message was clear, direct, and devastating. Tom was ending their relationship, stating that he didn't want to be with someone who had children. He said he liked Susan, but there was no room for kids in his future. For most people, it would have been a painful breakup. For Susan, it was a sentence of absolute rejection, and the final trigger. The letter was entered into evidence and read aloud in court. The tone wasn't cruel, but it was firm and honest. Tom wanted freedom, his own life, a future without the ties that Susan's children represented. In her mind, already consumed by emotional dependency, it was interpreted as an ultimatum. If the kids were the obstacle, then they had to go. That cold, tragic logic was born from desperation. The letter didn't ask for death, but in the wrong hands it was read like a code for exclusion. The prosecution used the letter to support the case for premeditation. Prosecutor Tommy Pope argued that Susan didn't act on impulse. She had been harboring frustration, enduring rejection, and idealizing Tom as her savior. Without him, she felt worthless. When the letter arrived, she was alone with her sons. The divorce was underway. Her mother was emotionally distant. Her abusive stepfather still lingered in her past. It was the perfect storm, and the letter became the spark. The defense, in turn, tried to downplay the letter's impact. They claimed it only intensified a depressive episode already in progress. Dr. Seymour explained that individuals with dependent personality disorder often interpret rejection as total emotional collapse. Susan saw her children as extensions of herself, so when Tom rejected them, she felt fully and personally rejected as well. There was no logic in what she did, only pain, confusion, and a desperate need to feel loved. But for the jury, the letter was a turning point. Alongside her confession, her history of lying, and the chilling execution of the crime, the letter revealed a concrete motive, and perhaps the most disturbing part, a possible sense of relief on Susan's part. By eliminating her children, she may have believed she was reclaiming love, attention, and a chance to start over. This wasn't just despair, it was a twisted desire to reset her life, even if that new beginning was soaked in blood. To this day, Tom Findlay's letter is viewed as a tragic document, not because of what it said, but because of how it was interpreted by a damaged, unraveling mind. Words meant to end a relationship became, in the wrong psyche, the fuel for one of the most horrific crimes in modern American history. That crumpled sheet of paper, written in Tom's steady hand, still echoes like a funeral whisper, "I don't want children." After being sentenced to life in prison, Susan Smith was transferred to the Camille Griffin Graham Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. In her first few months, she kept to herself, avoiding contact with other inmates. Her presence was disturbing, not just because she was a high-profile criminal, but because of the nature of her crime. Even in prison, killing your own children is the ultimate taboo. Other prisoners looked at her with suspicion, contempt, and, in many cases, pure hatred. Susan quickly realized that behind those walls, She was nothing more than a reflection of her past. But the silence didn't last. In the year 2000, a scandal erupted. Susan had been having sexual relationships with 2 prison guards. The investigation confirmed the encounters. Both officers were fired and criminally charged. The incident reinforced her image as manipulative, someone who weaponized vulnerability. The media latched on again. Her name once more filled headlines, now labeled as the woman who kept stirring scandal, even from behind bars. Because of the incident, Susan was transferred to Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood, a more isolated facility with stricter rules. There, she faced harsh restrictions, limited visitation, constant surveillance, and long periods of isolation. Even so, guards and staff reported that she still tried to emotionally manipulate those around her. She would change her tone, act fragile, express remorse, but never shed a tear for her children, only for herself. Internal reports documented numerous episodes of aggression. In sessions with social workers like Arlene Andrews, Susan would swing between victimhood and rage. Her attempts to project rehabilitation were undermined by her blank stares, rehearsed answers, and her refusal to fully acknowledge what she had done. She claimed to be sorry, but couldn't explain why. It was as if the act itself had become a mental block, a stain she couldn't even look at directly. Over the years, Susan tried to soften her public image. She wrote letters to the press, applied to rehabilitation programs, and in authorized interviews claimed she wanted a second chance. But the public never forgot. With every attempt at humanization came a wave of backlash, outrage on social media, protests outside the prison, letters of rejection from all across the country. The image of the grieving mother was gone. All that remained was a woman trapped in her own performance. Parole became a possibility in November of 2024. Susan submitted a formal request. The hearing was followed remotely by thousands of people. The result? Parole denied. According to witnesses, when she heard the decision, Susan flew into a rage, throwing objects, screaming for hours inside her cell. It was the confirmation that, to the world, she was still exactly what she tried to deny, the woman who fooled a nation and drowned her own children. Since the day of her confession, one question has hovered over the case like a shadow. Is Susan Smith a monster or a woman shattered by emotional collapse? Society, driven by outrage, urgency to judge, and the horror of the act itself, leaned toward the first answer. After all, what kind of mother straps her children into a car and lets them sink into a dark lake? What kind of person lies for 9 days, manipulating an entire country while her sons lay at the bottom of a reservoir? But the defense psychiatrists, like Dr. Seymour, painted a different picture. Susan, they argued, wasn't cold. She was broken, a victim of repeated abuse, deep rejection, and untreated mental illness. The strongest diagnosis, dependent personality disorder, characterized by extreme fear of abandonment and self-destructive behavior in pursuit of emotional connection. For Susan, being rejected by Tom Findlay wasn't just a breakup, it was an identity collapse. Still, critics pointed out, that doesn't justify murder. Millions of people endure rejection and trauma, and none of them commit infanticide. The line between illness and responsibility is thin, but it must be drawn. In the court of public opinion, Susan was already condemned. In the court of psychiatry, she became a case study, a woman with severe emotional instability whose actions were as much a product of pain as of a lack of moral boundaries. The case's complexity lies in that space between empathy and justice. Some argue that Susan needed treatment, not just punishment. Others say the suffering of Michael and Alexander wipes away any excuse. Prosecutor Tommy Pope, in his push for the death penalty, said, "There is no redemption for someone who looks at 2 living children and chooses to let them die." Defense attorney Judy Clark replied, "Suffering can turn us into monsters, but it doesn't make us less human." The debate continues to this day, in academic circles, legal forums, and true crime documentaries. Monster or mentally ill, cold or fragile, the answer may never be unanimous. Because Susan Smith isn't just a criminal case, she's a mirror, reflecting society's failure to protect, to treat, to recognize signs of emotional collapse, a warning of what can happen when silent pain meets emotional abandonment, and rage becomes action. What we do know is that through every parole denial, Susan has never shown full remorse. She's never spoken in depth about her children, never truly acknowledged the weight of the pain she caused. And maybe that's why, for so many, she'll never be seen as mentally ill, but as something far more difficult to define, a human abyss, wearing the face of a mother. David Smith, father of Michael Daniel and Alexander Tyler, was an ordinary man from South Carolina, a factory worker living a simple life marked by financial struggles and marital issues. When Susan announced the boys were missing, David dropped everything to help. He stood beside her on camera, held posters, wept in interviews. He was the desperate father, begging an unknown man for mercy, never knowing the real killer was sleeping beside him. Susan's confession wasn't just a blow for David, it was the destruction of his entire reality. He didn't just lose his children, he lost his faith, his footing, his sanity. When he heard they had been drowned by the one meant to protect them, David broke. In later interviews, he admitted he had considered ending his own life. The pain was constant, silent, cruel. And worst of all, there was no one to blame, except the woman he once loved, the mother of his children. During the trial, David testified with a trembling voice and tearful eyes. He described their final days together, Michael's laughter, Alexander's quiet ways. He said that when he saw them in their caskets, his heart was buried with them. He asked for justice, not revenge, but the look he gave Susan in court said everything. There would never be forgiveness. No insults were spoken, only silence, a silence that screamed louder than any words could. David tried to move on. Years later, he remarried and had more children, but as he said in interviews, nothing can replace what was taken. He wrote a book about his experience, a painful story of grief, rage, survival, and faith. He became a speaker at events for families affected by violent crime. But to this day, he avoids union. He avoids speaking Susan's name. He avoids lakes. Because every piece of his past is a reminder of everything he lost. He was also a victim of media coverage. Some accused him of being too cold in court. Others questioned his role during the early days of the case. But no one could see the war he fought just to keep breathing. Losing 2 children is devastating. Losing them at the hands of their own mother is inhuman. David didn't seek revenge. He sought silence, because sometimes the only way to endure pain is away from the noise. Today, David Smith still carries his grief like an invisible tattoo. A father betrayed by his wife, by the system, by fate. A man who saw the eyes of his children close forever for a reason he'll never understand. And yet, he kept going. Because deep down, he knows his pain is the last living memory of the life those boys could have had. And that's what he honors. The memory, not of Susan, but of Michael and of Alexander. On July 27, 1995, Susan Smith was handed her final sentence, life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The decision sparked mixed reactions. Some believed she deserved the death penalty. Others saw the verdict as fair, considering the psychiatric reports. From that day on, Susan stopped being a headline and became a prison number. But even locked away, she never stopped provoking reactions. During her early years in prison, Susan's presence was marked by scandals, erratic behavior, and constant attempts to cast herself as a victim. Every year, on the anniversary of the tragedy, her name returned to the headlines. News outlets questioned her mental health, her emotional manipulation, and even her physical appearance. Documentaries revisited the case, always circling back to the same moral dilemma. How far should justice go when dealing with someone who carries deep psychological trauma? The debate always came back, but the answers remained painfully divided. In 2024, the moment many feared finally arrived. Susan Smith became eligible for parole. Her request was filed well in advance, and the hearing was scheduled for November of that year. The public outcry reignited. Protests were organized. Petitions circulated. Media coverage revived a collective trauma. Inside prison, Susan appeared confident. In internal interviews, she said she was ready to start over, ready to prove to the world that she had changed. The hearing took place under heavy emotional tension. None of the victims' family members appeared in person, but they sent letters. The prosecution submitted a file filled with reports of prison misconduct, emotional manipulation, and a clear lack of genuine remorse. The defense argued that Susan had maintained decent behavior in recent years and had plans for rehabilitation, but her cold, defensive tone during her testimony worked against her. The verdict was clear: parole denied. Reports say that when Susan received the decision, she lost control. She threw objects, screamed, and cursed at the correctional officers. The emotional breakdown was so severe that she had to be sedated and placed in isolation for days. It was a second prison within prison, the internal collapse of someone finally forced to face the weight of what she had done, and what could never be undone. For Susan, freedom wasn't just about walking out. It was symbolic. And once again, it was denied. Her next opportunity for parole won't come for another 2 years. But for many, each request will reopen the wound. Each hearing, a new public trial. Time has not erased what Susan Smith did. And while she tries to escape the iron bars, the real prison, the one surrounding the memory of Michael and Alexander, remains intact, silent, and eternal. When Susan Smith first appeared on national television, with tear-filled eyes and a trembling voice, the country saw the face of maternal grief. But once the truth was revealed, that same face became something far more disturbing, a symbol of calculated deceit, of staged guilt, of emotional manipulation on a national scale. From that moment on, Susan wasn't just remembered. She was portrayed, parodied, analyzed, and dissected in every possible cultural format. Her case inspired full episodes of crime series like Law & Order, which fictionalized narratives of angelic-looking mothers who kill. In the show Arrested Development, a direct reference to Susan's case caused both discomfort and reflection when a character, watching coverage of the tragedy, quipped, "Good for her." It exposed how absurdity and dark humor can coexist in the strangest corners of American culture. The tragedy had become entertainment, provocation, metaphor. Music didn't stay silent either. In 1995, the band Blind Melon released Car Seat, God's Presence, a haunting song inspired by Susan's children. The lyrics feel like a lament, a desperate attempt to imagine the view from inside that car as it sank slowly. Other artists like Hayden in When This Is Over and Red Star Belgrade in Union SC also addressed the tragedy from different emotional perspectives, from anger to sorrow. It was as if the collective pain needed more voices to process what had happened. In film and literature, Susan Smith became an archetype, the woman who shattered the sacred image of motherhood. Pretty face, gentle gestures, and a soul capable of the unthinkable. This contrast fueled debates around misogyny, psychoanalysis, and society's strange fascination with female killers. How can a mother also be a murderer? How can someone so ordinary become the monster of the moment? Society never stopped asking or consuming. At the same time, the case sounded an alarm about the media's power to shape public perception before the truth is known. The initial outpouring of support, fueled by headlines and televised tears, built a collective illusion. And when the truth finally came out, it revealed how easily we fall for appearances. Susan Smith became a symbol of distrust, the face of a lie that everyone believed, proof that evil doesn't always come with fangs. Sometimes it comes with a cry for help and a microphone in hand. Decades later, the name Susan Smith still represents tragedy disguised. Her image is immortalized in archives, scripts, songs, and even memes. She's not just remembered, she's replayed. And for better or worse, she remains a brutal reminder that horror doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers through a smile. The moment Susan Smith claimed that a black man had kidnapped her children, she triggered a narrative deeply rooted in the American psyche. All it took was a vague description, black, slim, somewhere between 20 and 30, and law enforcement launched into high gear while the public responded with fear. Black men in Union were stopped, interrogated, followed. Many didn't even know why. It was enough to be in the wrong place, or worse, to have the wrong skin color. The media didn't escape the racial trap either. Newspapers and TV stations aired sketches of the suspect during prime time, without a shred of proof. Viewership skyrocketed, fueled by the dangerous fantasy of a suffering white mother versus an unknown black predator. The story was convenient. It boosted ratings, and more than anything, it reinforced a stereotype that has criminalized the black body for centuries. It was like reliving the narrative lynchings of the past. only this time broadcast live. By the time the truth emerged, the damage was done. No formal apology was ever issued to the innocent black men who were stopped and questioned. But the public pressure was intense. Civil rights activists denounced the incident as yet another example of racial bias in the justice system. Sheriff Howard Wells, visibly shaken, made a public statement acknowledging that Susan's lie had put an entire community at risk. But no system can undo the trauma of being accused for simply existing. The choice of a black kidnapper wasn't random. It was calculated. Susan knew exactly what kind of reaction that lie would provoke, and she knew she would be heard and believed. That detail made the crime even more twisted. It wasn't enough to kill her children. She had to reshape the truth to protect herself. And the most effective way, use racism as a shield. Turn historical fear into an alibi. That lie wasn't just cowardly. It was politically, culturally, and historically violent. The Susan Smith case, then, isn't just about infanticide. It's a portrait of the real America, where a white woman is immediately comforted, believed, and embraced, while a black man is seen as guilty before he's even seen. That's why her name still carries a double weight: the pain of the direct victims, Michael and Alexander, and the symbolic pain of every black person ever falsely accused, simply because of the color of their skin. Decades later, the echo of that lie still lingers. In protests, in conversations about systemic racism, in studies about racial injustice and selective prosecution, Susan Smith didn't just deceive a nation. She exposed how vulnerable it still is to a poisoned narrative, a narrative where skin color decides who is the villain, even when the real monster is smiling for the cameras, weighed down with guilt, and hiding blood-stained hands behind a lake's silence. Even after 30 years behind bars, the name Susan Smith still stirs discomfort, not just for what she did, but for what she represents. In today's era of conversations about mental health, femicide, systemic racism, and criminal justice reform, her case remains a centerpiece, used to expose the system's failures and to warn us about the limits of empathy. She's still alive, still imprisoned, and, surprisingly to many, still eligible for release. In November 2024, Susan had her first parole hearing. The decision was unanimous: parole denied. The South Carolina Parole Board cited her lack of remorse, records of unstable behavior in prison, and continued risk to society. Even so, the law allows a new review every 2 years, which means in 2026 she can try again, and when she does, it will reopen the wounds of a country that still remembers exactly what she did. The public remains vigilant. Online petitions are already circulating, demanding that Susan never be released. Organizations that support victims of violent crimes speak out every time her name appears in court documents. Many of the victims' family members, including relatives of the children's father, still live under the psychological weight of the crime. Every new hearing rips their scars wide open. Every possibility of release brings back the feeling of injustice. Inside prison, Susan tries to keep a routine. She has access to books, educational programs, and psychological counseling. But for security reasons, she remains isolated from most inmates. Reports show she still alternates between calm periods and emotional outbursts. Some officers describe her as manipulative. Others say she's completely detached from reality. But no one, not even her supervisors, seems to believe her remorse is real. Documentaries, podcasts, and true crime videos continue to revisit her case. It's impossible to talk about criminal mothers without mentioning her name. She's become a reference point, a case study, a warning. Her image is used in criminology classes, domestic violence seminars, and discussions on racial bias in the justice system. At the same time, she's become the subject of conspiracy theories, morbid curiosity, and even fan pages, a sad but real phenomenon that reflects society's strange fascination with extreme crimes. Today, in 2025, Susan Smith is still alive, but imprisoned in a name that will never be forgotten. Every year on the anniversary of her son's deaths, the media revisits the case. Every time parole is discussed, the country re-examines her legacy. And even if she walks free someday, she'll never be truly free, because some crimes go beyond the prison walls, and hers is one of them. Forever. Susan Lee Vaughn Smith, born September 26, 1971, a child of tragedy, scarred by suicide attempts, silent abuse, and a lifelong hunger for love. For many, those facts don't excuse her, but they help explain the complexity of the monster that hid behind smiles, tears, and carefully rehearsed words. She wasn't just a criminal. She was a raw, unsettling portrait of what ignored suffering can become when it's left to rot. When Susan took the lives of Michael and Alexander, she destroyed more than her own family. She shattered the image of the mother as a symbol of safety. In American culture, motherhood holds an almost sacred weight. By breaking that silent covenant, Susan became a pariah, misunderstood by some, despised by many. Her name became synonymous with emotional betrayal, with domestic destruction, with shattered trust. The woman everyone once wanted to console became the woman everyone wanted to forget. But who is Susan Smith now? After decades behind bars, her once youthful face has been replaced by lines of time, weariness, and bottled rage. Few images of her are released, but when they are, they still spark extreme reactions. Some look at her with disgust, others with fear, and some try to see a sick woman, destroyed by her own past. The truth is, Susan is imprisoned in more than one way, not just physically, but trapped in the social role of villain, a role that, whether she admits it or not, she wrote for herself. She's written letters, taken part in interviews, rehearsed words of regret, but none of it has touched the public like the silent cries of her sons sinking into the lake. Nothing she says now is stronger than the stillness that followed that October night in 1994. She may try to rewrite her story, but the image the world sees is of the mother who killed and lied, the woman who placed her own emptiness above the lives of two defenseless children. Even among experts, Susan remains a point of contention. Some see her as a symbol of emotional breakdown and social negligence. Others use her case to challenge the limits of psychiatric diagnosis in criminal trials. But everyone agrees on one thing: she will never be just Susan again. Her name became urban legend, case study, dark warning. The woman behind the scandal was lost in her own reflection, trapped between guilt she avoids, freedom she'll never have, and a self she can never reclaim. Today, Susan Smith is no longer a young mother. She's a 53-year-old woman, aged in confinement, forgotten by friends and family, watched by strangers and marked forever. She may walk out of prison one day. She may change her name. She may try to start over. But no matter where she goes, her past will follow. Because there are faces the world never forgets, and hers is one of them. Despite testimonies, investigations, and a meticulous trial, the Susan Smith case still leaves behind questions no one has ever been able to answer. One of the darkest: were the murders premeditated or the result of emotional collapse? Tom Findley's letter pointed to motive. Her choice of the lake suggested planning, but the defense insisted it was all a sudden breakdown, a desperate act with no logic. The truth might lie somewhere in between, in a murky place like the waters that swallowed the boys. Another lingering question: did Susan really intend to die alongside her children, or was that part of the story crafted afterward? In her testimony, she claimed she meant to commit suicide, but that something stopped her from getting in the car. Yet no real evidence supported that claim. No attempt, no action, only words, spoken after the crime. Was her own death part of the act, or did she simply back out in fear? Her silence still offers no clarity. There's also the question of remorse. Did Susan Smith ever feel genuine guilt? Psychologists and social workers say she expressed sorrow in private sessions, but never publicly, and even those reports are contradictory. Some say she refers to her sons as obstacles. Others say she calls them angels now at peace. But there's never been a raw, direct, unfiltered statement of regret. And that leads to a final, haunting question. Does she still believe the version of events she told herself? Another unsettling thought lingers. If given the chance to relive it all, would she do the same thing? That question can never be answered, but specialists see it as critical when assessing the risk in future parole requests. So far, Susan has shown herself to be ambiguous, inconsistent, emotionally unstable. What she might say today could be just what she thinks others want to hear, or it could be the truth. And that, not knowing, may be the most disturbing part of all. And finally, the most uncomfortable question of all: did the system fail Susan, Or did it fail Michael and Alexander? If Susan was a victim of abuse, emotional neglect, psychiatric abandonment, and cycles of violence, why wasn't she helped before she collapsed? But if all that pain became a shield for the murder of 2 innocent children, where is the line between victim and perpetrator? In the end, the Susan Smith case may not be about answers, but about the pain that lives in what was never said. These questions don't appear in court documents. They're not in reports, not in closing arguments. They float like ghosts behind the scenes of the story. They haunt investigators, psychologists, journalists, and maybe they'll never be answered, because some stories, even when told from beginning to end, stay open, like scars that never fully heal, like lakes that hide more than they reflect, like the name Susan Smith. The Susan Smith case wasn't just a crime. It was an emotional earthquake that shook the very foundations of trust, empathy, and motherhood. When a mother destroys her own children, the world stops. What should be sacred becomes a nightmare. What should protect annihilates. The story settles into the collective subconscious, not as a memory, but as a constant whisper. And so, Susan Smith became more than a name. She became a scar. Decades have passed, but Michael and Alexander are still here. Their faces appear in news reports, academic studies, documentaries. They've become symbols of betrayed innocence. Every time people speak of failed justice, mental instability, or emotional manipulation, their names echo again. They never had a chance. And that absence, that life stolen by force, is what makes this case eternal. Because some losses aren't measured in years, but in silences. Susan, on the other hand, has aged behind bars. But time hasn't freed her. It has only made her more invisible. Her face is now remembered not as a memory, but as a warning. Her name is cited in investigative training, lectures on criminal profiling, and studies on emotional disorders. But never with warmth, never with longing, only with that uneasy feeling that makes us ask, how was this possible? And maybe even more chilling, could it happen again? The town of Union never fully recovered either. John D. Long Lake is still there, still and silent, as if holding on to the last breaths of the tragedy. The site became a place of pilgrimage for the curious, and a place to avoid for longtime residents. Some wounds don't close. They just adapt to the air. And even if the town moves on, that lake still carries the weight of a crime time couldn't drown. Because some crimes become legends, not in a glorious way, but in a traumatic one. They go beyond logic. They resist explanation. They root themselves in the subconscious like a slow-acting poison. The Susan Smith case is one of those stories, a reminder that evil doesn't always wear a cruel face. Sometimes it cries, sometimes it begs for help, sometimes it smiles for the cameras, while doing the unthinkable. Susan Smith didn't just kill her children, she killed the hope the world had placed in her. She betrayed the image of the protective mother, manipulated the empathy of millions, and left deep scars on the collective faith in maternal instinct. Her story forces us to look at the darkest corners of human nature, where love becomes distorted, pain suffocates, and lies disguise themselves as despair. Maybe we'll never truly know who Susan Smith was in the moment she let that car drift toward the lake's depths. A woman in collapse? A cold, calculated criminal? Or a soul so shattered that she tried to erase from life everything that reminded her of her own pain? What we do know is this: with that one act, she changed the course of countless lives, starting with the ones who should still be alive today. And so the question lingers in the air, heavy as the fog over John D. Long Lake. How many other Susans are out there, smiling for the camera, hiding the abyss behind their eyes? If this story impacted you, help support our channel. Like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, send it to someone who follows true crime stories, and subscribe with notifications turned on. Here, we give voice to the victims and dive deep where few dare to go. See you in the next story.